Everybody can hear me? Great. Thank you for coming. My name is Francesco Paola, CEO of Solinea. We are a leading provider of software and services to enable enterprises to adopt cloud computing technologies and software. I'm joined today by my colleague Luke Heideke, one of our lead directors of engineering. And today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we help enterprises adopt, a specific enterprise in financial services adopt continuous integration, continuous deployment, automation tool chains in a secure and compliant manner to enable agility in the IT organization. So first of all, who is Solinea? What do we do? We've been around for about 3 years now. We are primarily a professional services organization that helps companies adopt cloud computing solutions. We specialize in what we call open infrastructure solutions, which are comprised of open source software, CI/CD automation, agile methodologies, as well as commodity hardware where organizations or whatever organizations have. We have a presence on both coasts. We focus on North America, as well as we have a strong presence in Asia, primarily in Japan. And we've worked with some of the leading global organizations in the world to help them bring these new fast, rapid changing technologies into their organization. What we'll do today is we're going to give you a sense of what we did for one of our customers, the fourth largest global financial exchange, how we adapted our approach of deploying CI/CD automation, toolchain, and processes into the organization to work within the confines of security and compliance requirements of a heavily regulated environment. The overarching objectives for this organization, and then I'll turn it over to Luke, because you need to understand the context, is that they wanted to enable business agility into how their IT services were delivered and deployed and managed, provide transparency to their organization to be able to price IT services on an on-demand basis. And for that, they chose to implement a hybrid cloud solution. But frankly, the infrastructure wasn't enough to really take them to where they needed to be. They needed to implement a CI/CD automation toolchain instead of processes to make it much more agile, or the process much more agile across the organization. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke, and he'll walk you through the process and solution that we put in place.
Thanks. So, coming into this client at the start, it's evident that they had that sort of classic sort of continuous integration, continuous development problem. They wanted to move towards where they could really have a better way of reacting to sort of outside and internal requirements to increase the velocity of change within their applications. So the initial state was what we sort of started with, talking with cross-functional teams, talking with the various, from management down to the engineers, to capture the initial state. We wanted to identify a lot of what their current challenges were and the kinds of things that they might have to change, both in technical, non-technical requirements and processes and procedures to really fully adopt cloud computing and more distributed applications. One of the key things that we saw that was difficult for them as they deployed new applications was that it could take upwards of 30 days from initial VM request to a VM being provisioned and ready for an application team to take over, as it went through all of these very complicated sequential gates and manual processes for approval. It was a lot of manual review, a lot of documentation that had to be reviewed, things like that that we identified that could have been automated and should have been automated. One of the key things also was that the handoffs were, as typical with lots of enterprise clients of ours, that the functional silos were highly segregated, and that the handoffs between those were manual and hard to trace. So what we worked with them is to provide that sort of final state plan for what the end-to-end delivery pipeline might look like, and then include definitions of what tools, but also the organizational roles that might have to change, the workflow that has to be changed, because with the adoption of these really powerful cloud compute platforms, it's just dropping a tool into place without changing how you do business doesn't allow you to extract the full benefit of the platform. So the end goal was really to shorten the delivery lifecycle, to increase the velocity of change within the applications, and then be able to allow the handoff and the processes required by governance and policy and law and things like that to be as lightweight as possible and as automated as possible. So as we kind of came with that plan, there was obviously quite a few barriers to overcome when trying to take such a large organization into more modern development practices. And we wanted to make sure that we identified some of these, and we'll talk about actually two of those that were able to help the client figure out creative ways of passing by them. And the first one is the compliance audit process. So they were really challenged by this legacy process that had been built up over 20, 30 more years of waterfall development practices, and it was confounded by the additional regulatory requirements for their industry and your industry. And the side effect of this complicated workflow process was that it was very hard to audit for compliance and very hard to tell where in the process things were within the life cycle of an application deployment. They also used very legacy tools, including Lotus Notes, and very extremely proprietary workflows defined within those tools that were extremely difficult to pull out and especially for new teams to be able to extract what the workflow was, what they should be complying with, because it was such an opaque sort of workflow with the legacy systems. And the task routing was extremely complicated also. So with the transition to cloud services, they really needed to lean towards changing the overall objective of what the end goal of each of these various stakeholders was within the process. And that kind of went into two parts within this. So we looked at the refactoring the processes and automation. The first piece is really coordinating the teams, a change in culture towards the common objective of being able to deploy new capabilities for their customers and their own users internally. And the second piece was automated workflow. So you all are probably familiar with normal modern CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development practices. But it's really creating things as infrastructure as code, treating your infrastructure definitions just as importantly as your application code itself. We also looked a lot at image-based application deployments, so you have an immutable image that you're deploying applications through the entire life cycle, from development, test, pre-prod, and prod, as one single object, and the environment definitions don't affect the core capability of the application as it moves through that life cycle. The other big thing as far as the process was factoring out those common processes that many stakeholders had very similar tasks and refactoring those into automated steps within a larger workflow. And for compliance, a lot of that was, as part of these automated processes, whether it's using Jenkins or Packer for the images, was really keeping metadata of the sort of the lineage and the overall workflow of that artifact and approval process, keeping that metadata in a reusable, machine-readable format for future compliant audit processes. So the next piece that we looked at was security zones and the isolation of both environments but also users and applications. The current firewalls between definitely required by compliance. They also require two-factor authentication for users for authorization and authentication within each of these security zones. And we had to make sure that as they adopted this new cloud platform, that they were able to really keep intact these very important security zones for compliance and overall in-depth security for their platform. So we looked at how do we take these different components within the tool chain and where do they make sense to be placed. The problem was in development, it's the cultural norm to, if it's a development tool, it's not treated as something that's important towards production, even though those tools that you're deploying as part of the tool chain are integral to the overall life cycle of the application and should be treated as a production system for internal consumers. And the problem with putting it in production is that then with those access barriers, it's very difficult for developers to fully integrate these tools as part of their overall workflow. So we looked at providing really a CI tool chain enclave DMZ rather, or DMZ, that could be protected with a set of APIs and allow all the various stakeholders within the application lifecycle to be able to access the tools, use two-factor authentication, have all the security controls, but really use sort of modern development methods where instead of this sort of previous method of focusing on perimeter security and you know, the separation of zones being the primary focus, we're looking at taking the ownership of security and distributing that within the APIs and the applications themselves. And the big thing was adding these additional controls to both the cloud management platforms and the infrastructure as a service itself to enforce these restrictive authorization and authentication policies. So the lessons learned as we went through this compliant audit process and the security zones was to, we found that it's important to remember as an organization that this is hard. It's not difficult, and it shouldn't be taken as a you're going to deploy the system in a bubble, and you're going to be able to walk away, and it's going to be perfect the first time. It needs to be iterated over. Just like good code, just like good processes, you need to iterate over the system as a whole, the systems of systems, so that you can grow and change the organization with it, and that everybody from management down to the technician level understands that it's not expected to be necessarily an easy process, and that the technical and policy driven challenges you have to all be committed to overcoming. And the next piece of that kind of flows into it is that both a technology adoption, but also an adoption of a different way of thinking about the end goal of your applications is extremely important as you develop more distributed applications, as you go into more of these microservice architectures, things like that, that you have to change how you do some of your business for operations to really account for the shift in how you're able to, the velocity of change expected by by operations, by developers, and by the rest of the stakeholders. So that's sort of being prepared for change. One of the things that we found with a lot of the legacy security controls is that they tend to be targeted, the interpretation of those tend to be targeted towards the legacy challenges and legacy systems architectures. And there's that whole adage where the structure of your systems mirrors the structure of your organization, and needing to analyze the security model. A lot of our time was spent with the client analyzing the security model and adapting to the new emerging technologies, adapting those security challenges to the new model. And that, again, as I mentioned, focusing on the API, focusing on application controls rather than relying just on perimeter security. The whole thing of defense in depth, things like that. I want to thank you all for kind of listening in a little bit about the challenges. Stop by our table. I'd like to talk about these kinds of things. Follow us on Solinea Inc. We're always hiring. And then also, we're very into the OpenStack community. We have a lot of contributors. I believe we have 5 talks at the OpenStack Summit from some of our engineers about use cases specifically with some of Kubernetes on OpenStack, about some of these CI/CD challenges within our OpenStack development environments, things like that. And appreciate you coming by. That's it.